Imagine a small cut on your finger. You barely notice it. You keep working in the garden, in the field, in the kitchen. 3 days later, your arm is swollen. Red streaks are crawling up towards your shoulder. You have a fever that won't break. 7 days later, you are dead. Not from a war, not from a disease with a terrifying name. From a scratch. This was not rare. This was not unlucky. Before the 1940s, this was simply how a huge number of human beings died. So here's the question that sounds simple but isn't. What actually killed the most people, in all of human history, before antibiotics existed? It's not what you think. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a small cut the same way again. Ask most people this question and they'll guess plague. Or war. Or famine. Those killed millions, yes. But they came in waves, terrible, then gone. The real answer was quieter. It never stopped. It didn't need an army, or a famine, or a black rat carrying fleas. It needed something far more common. It needed a wound. Any wound. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. For most of human history, the leading cause of death wasn't a disease you caught. It was an infection you got from getting hurt at all. Childbirth. Surgery. A splinter. A rusty nail. A tooth extraction. Every single one of these ordinary events carried something close to a coin flip chance of a slow, agonizing death. Not from the injury itself, but from what grew inside it afterward. So the real question isn't what disease killed the most people. It's this. Why was simply getting hurt, at any point in history before the 1940s, one of the most dangerous things a human being could do? Here's what nobody could see, and for centuries nobody even suspected existed. The moment skin breaks, bacteria. Invisible, silent, already living on your skin and in the air around you, pour into the wound. In a body with modern medicine, your immune system fights most of them off, and if it can't, antibiotics finish the job. But before the 1940s, there was no second line of defense, none. Once bacteria like Staphylococcus or Streptococcus got into deep tissue or the bloodstream, doctors had almost nothing to offer. They could clean a wound. They could pray. They could amputate a limb, hoping to cut the infection off before it spread further, a brutal, desperate gamble that itself killed nearly half the patients who underwent it. Now think about what that meant for something we consider completely routine today, surgery. Picture a surgeon in the 1800s. Skilled, fast, confident. He doesn't wash his hands. Why would he? Germ theory doesn't exist yet as common practice. He might operate on one patient, then walk straight to the next, wiping his scalpel on his own coat. A coat stiff and dark with the dried blood of dozens of previous operations, worn almost as a badge of experience. Surgeons of this era were even judged, informally, by how filthy their operating aprons were. A crusted, blood-caked coat wasn't a warning sign. It was a resume. The surgery itself might succeed perfectly. The tumor removed, the bone set, the patient alive and breathing on the table. And then, days later, infection would set in and kill the very patient the surgery had just saved. This had a name doctors used at the time, almost with a shrug, as if it were simply the cost of doing business. Hospitalism. A mysterious deadly fever that seemed to appear in hospitals themselves, as if the buildings were somehow cursed. They weren't cursed. They were, unknowingly, factories for exactly the kind of infection that had no cure. Which raises an unsettling question. If hospitals were this dangerous, why did anyone survive childbirth at all? Here's a detail that should stop you cold. In parts of 19th century Europe, women who gave birth in prestigious teaching hospitals, with trained doctors, died of a raging infection called childbed fever at rates far higher than women who gave birth at home with an untrained midwife. For years, doctors couldn't explain why the better-equipped option was killing more mothers. The answer, discovered by a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, was almost too simple to believe. Doctors were performing autopsies on infected corpses in the morning, then walking directly into the maternity ward to deliver babies, without washing their hands in between. They were carrying death from one room to the next on their own fingers, and had absolutely no idea. When Semmelweis ordered doctors to wash their hands with a chlorine solution, deaths dropped dramatically, sometimes by over 90%, almost overnight. And here's the twist that makes this story almost tragic. Nobody believed him. The idea that invisible particles on a doctor's hands could kill a patient seemed insulting, absurd, even offensive to the medical establishment of the time. Semmelweis was mocked, dismissed, and eventually institutionalized. He died in an asylum, ironically, from an infected wound. The man who had discovered one of the most important facts in the history of medicine died from the exact problem he'd tried to warn everyone about. So picture the scale of this now. Every childbirth, every surgery, Every battlefield wound, every splinter that got a little too deep, every single one of these ordinary human moments was, quietly, a roll of the dice against an invisible enemy nobody could see, name, or fight. During wars, this became almost unbearably obvious. In the American Civil War, and in World War I decades later, historians estimate that infection, not bullets, not bombs, killed more soldiers than the weapons themselves. A man could survive a gunshot wound completely intact, only to die 2 weeks later from the infection that grew inside it. This is the moment the story shifts from tragedy to something more remarkable. Because eventually, someone noticed something strange growing in a petri dish, and everything changed. In 1928, a scientist named Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to a messy laboratory. Sitting on his bench was a petri dish he'd forgotten to clean, contaminated with a strange blue-green mold. Around that mold, in a clear ring, all the bacteria had died. Most scientists would have simply thrown the dish away. Fleming didn't. He looked closer and asked the question that changed the future of every human being on Earth. What if this mold isn't ruining my experiment? What if it's killing the bacteria on purpose? That mold was penicillium. And what it produced, penicillin, would go on to become the first true antibiotic, a weapon against the invisible war that had been quietly killing humans since the beginning of our species. But here's the part almost nobody knows. It took over a decade after Fleming's discovery before penicillin was actually mass-produced and used to save lives, arriving just in time for World War II, where for the first time in history, a wounded soldier's infection was no longer an automatic death sentence. Once antibiotics spread through hospitals in the 1940s and 50s, something happened that we rarely stop to appreciate. Surgery became survivable in a completely new way. Childbirth stopped being one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. A scraped knee stopped being a potential death sentence. In the span of about one generation, one of the oldest and most consistent killers in human history, infection from ordinary wounds, was pushed back almost entirely. It's easy to forget this now, because we live entirely on the other side of it. We take a course of pills for a bacterial infection without a second thought. But for every human being who lived before the 1940s, that same infection was a genuine gamble with death, one that had claimed more lives, quietly and consistently, than plagues, famines, and wars combined. So the next time you get a small cut and reach for a bottle of antiseptic without even thinking about it, remember this. You are holding, in your hand, the solution to the single deadliest, quietest killer in human history. Not a monster, not a war, not a plague with a terrifying name, just an ordinary wound. And, for the first time in 300,000 years, the ability to make sure it doesn't kill you.